Gardening in England is more than a pastime. It is a deeply rooted cultural phenomenon that has shaped landscapes, literature, and lifestyles across centuries. From the manicured lawns of stately homes to the modest allotment plots behind rows of terraced housing, gardening has evolved from a necessity to a leisure activity, then into a symbol of national identity. The English garden has long been admired, copied, and celebrated both domestically and abroad, and the practice of recreational gardening continues to thrive in every corner of the country. But how did this transformation occur? What social, economic, and aesthetic forces drove the English to pick up their trowels not just for sustenance, but for pleasure? The history of gardening in England stretches back to the medieval period, when horticulture was primarily functional, focused on the cultivation of herbs, vegetables, and medicinal plants within monastic communities, and the landed estates of the nobility. Over time, gardening became intertwined with artistic expression, scientific inquiry, and notions of order and beauty. The influence of European styles during the Tudor and Stuart periods introduced elements of formality and ornamentation, while the Enlightenment and colonial exploration of the Georgian and Victorian eras brought exotic species and a wider public interest in botany. By the 20th century, gardening had become democratized, no longer the preserve of the elite but a widely enjoyed hobby among all social classes. Wartime initiatives such as the Dig for Victory campaign and post-war urban planning further embedded gardening into everyday life. Today, gardening in England remains one of the most popular leisure activities, celebrated in television programs, at flower shows like Chelsea, and within millions of private and community gardens. It connects people to nature, fosters well-being, and provides a space for self-expression and sustainability. The Royal Horticultural Society, RHS, established in 1804, continues to lead public enthusiasm, offering resources, awards, and exhibitions that reflect gardening's enduring appeal. This essay explores the evolution of gardening as a hobby in England, tracing its roots from medieval utility to modern-day recreation. It examines the shifting motives, styles, and societal roles that have defined gardening through different historical periods. By understanding this progression, we can appreciate how gardening has not only mirrored broader cultural trends but also carved out a distinct place in English life. Gardening in medieval England was primarily functional, rooted in the need to cultivate food, herbs, and medicinal plants. Unlike the ornamental gardens of later centuries, early English gardens were utilitarian spaces, often enclosed within monastic walls, or the grounds of manorial estates. These gardens reflected the social and religious structures of the time, with monks, nuns, and estate workers tending to them with both spiritual devotion and practical necessity. Monastic communities were pivotal in preserving horticultural knowledge during the early Middle Ages. Cloister gardens, typically situated within the rectangular courtyards of monasteries, were designed for quiet contemplation, as well as the cultivation of essential plants. These included herbs for healing, such as rue, sage, and lavender, as well as vegetables like leeks and onions. The writings of Benedictine monks, including those from the influential St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, document the use and maintenance of such gardens. Harvey, 1981. These enclosed spaces were often divided into neat beds and surrounded by hedges or timber fences, reflecting an early sense of order and symbolism that would later influence formal garden design. Outside the cloisters, manor houses and castles also featured gardens, though these were generally less systematic and more pragmatic. Kitchen gardens supported large households, providing food that supplemented hunting and animal husbandry. Walled gardens offered both protection from animals and a microclimate conducive to growing more delicate crops. These gardens were usually managed by skilled gardeners or estate staff, and were considered essential to the operation of a self-sufficient estate. During the 12th and 13th centuries, gardening began to incorporate more aesthetic elements, though these remained modest. Influences from the Islamic world, brought back through crusaders and increased trade, introduced ornamental plants such as roses and lilies to England. These were often featured in small enclosed pleasure gardens known as Herbals, which were designed for private enjoyment by the nobility. Hobhouse, 2002. Herbals typically included turf seats, fragrant herbs, and flowering plants arranged in geometric patterns, an early nod to the later formal gardens of the Renaissance. Literary and artistic sources from this period also provide insight into garden life. Medieval romances and illuminated manuscripts often depicted garden scenes as places of courtship, reflection, and spiritual allegory. The garden became a metaphor for paradise, purity, and the human soul, a theme frequently explored in religious texts and poetry of the time. Crouch, 2011. These symbolic associations elevated the garden beyond its practical role, laying the groundwork for gardening as a form of personal and spiritual expression. The knowledge of plants and gardening techniques was shared through manuscripts and oral tradition. But it wasn't until the late medieval period that more systematic horticultural texts began to emerge. The Tractatus de Herbis and similar works catalogued plants and their properties, serving both medicinal and gardening purposes. As literacy grew, so too did access to gardening knowledge, sowing the seeds for gardening as a personal pursuit, rather than a purely professional or monastic duty. By the close of the medieval era, gardening in England had begun to shift subtly from necessity to leisure. While still primarily functional, gardens were increasingly spaces of beauty and introspection. The groundwork was being laid for the dramatic transformation that would occur during the Renaissance and beyond, when gardening would come to signify taste, intellect, and social status. In summary, medieval gardening in England was deeply intertwined with monastic life, estate management, and early aesthetic preferences. Though primarily utilitarian, these gardens were not devoid of beauty or meaning. They served as both larders and sanctuaries, places of healing and symbols of divine order. The progression from enclosed herb gardens to structured pleasure spaces hinted at a broader cultural shift, one that would eventually reframe gardening as a cherished and voluntary pastime. The Tudor and Stuart periods, 1485–1714, marked a significant turning point in the history of gardening in England. During this era, gardening began to evolve from a primarily functional and spiritual activity into an increasingly aesthetic and recreational pursuit. Influenced by Renaissance ideals and international exchanges, English gardens of this time reflected both artistic ambition and social prestige. The elite no longer saw gardens solely as spaces for growing produce. They became canvases for display, contemplation, and scientific curiosity. Under the Tudors, royal and noble gardens grew in complexity and grandeur. King Henry VIII's reign saw the construction of elaborate gardens at Hampton Court Palace, influenced by the Renaissance styles of France and Italy. These gardens featured geometric layouts, fountains, knot gardens, and topiary, demonstrating a new emphasis on symmetry and ornamentation. Strong, 1998. The knot garden, in particular, became a hallmark of Tudor estate design. These intricate patterns of clipped box hedges filled with colored gravel or herbs were not only decorative, but also signaled refined taste and wealth. The arrival of new plants from Europe and beyond also played a critical role in expanding the possibilities of English gardening. Increased trade and exploration introduced a range of exotic flora to England, including tulips, marigolds, and carnations. These imports were eagerly cultivated by members of the aristocracy and emerging middle class, who sought to display their access to rare and beautiful specimens. This period also witnessed the rise of herbals, books that detailed the properties and appearances of plants, often with illustrated guides. One of the most significant was John Gerard's Herbal, 1597, which became a cornerstone of horticultural knowledge for both practical and ornamental gardening. Arber, 2010. Gardening literature in this period began to shift its focus from monastic and medicinal use to domestic and aesthetic concerns. Authors such as Thomas Hill, who published The Gardener's Labyrinth 1577, provided practical advice alongside philosophical reflections on nature and beauty. These texts contributed to a broader cultural appreciation of gardening as an intellectual and artistic endeavor. Gardening was no longer solely the domain of monastics or estate laborers. It was becoming a recognized hobby for landowners, scholars, and even women of the gentry. The Stuart period, particularly under King James I and Charles I, continued this trajectory. Formal gardens, often influenced by the French and Dutch models, became increasingly fashionable. Landscape architects such as Inigo Jones, and garden designers like John Trenscant the Elder, pushed the boundaries of what English gardens could be. The Tredescants, father and son, were particularly influential, not only in introducing new plant species, but also in establishing one of the first botanical collections in England. Their private garden in Lambeth served as both a scientific repository and a public curiosity, foreshadowing the later development of botanical gardens. Spencer, 1990.